Ready for coming. This is the Drupal Distributions and Recipes Initiative update. I have the slides available at jimbir.ch/Drupal recipes. There's a ton of links in my presentation, so you can follow along or check it out later, and hopefully start contributing to the initiative. I am Jim Birch. I'm an engineering manager at Canopy Studios. I'm the maintainer of a few primarily configuration management modules. Working at an agency, I'd like to not rebuild things all the time, so I kind of make modules that help along with that. I'm the former organizer of the Drupal Chicago meetup and midcamp in Chicago, and I am the recipes initiative coordinator. I'm not a lead, I'm not the most technical person in the room, but I'm trying to help this effort underway. So I work at Canopy Studios. Canopy designs, builds, and supports websites for clients who want to make a positive impact, and we're currently hiring for contract Drupal developers. If you or you know of someone, reach out. So let's talk about the initiative. Last year in Portland at DrupalCon, in the Dries note, Dries presented the idea of starter templates to help ambitious site builders quickly and easily build out solutions. From this, something that had been happening in the distributions and configuration team, I use the word team loosely, was that the recipes idea was born. Alex Pott, who's the initiative lead and a core committer, wrote a bunch of code that allows you to start sites using recipes. And he presented this first last year at DrupalCon Prague in 2022. So this is a link to his presentation there. It's a little bit more technical than I'm going to get into, but worth watching if you are interested. So what's the problem? There's been a number of ways over the years to come up with starters. The most common is distributions, and then in Drupal core there are install profiles. So maintaining those things is very difficult. If anybody in the room has tried to do it before, you can only start with it. You can't add an install profile or a distribution onto an existing site. You can't uninstall it because it hooks into everything. And if you are the maintainer of these things, you need to maintain all of the dependencies. So if you use ctools and there's a bug in it, you need to patch that bug as soon as it comes out for all of your people that are using your distributions. So it's an investment into the long-term piece of that software. There are other solutions, like features. Incredibly common in Drupal 7, still around in modern Drupal. They're hard to share, like distributions. Because they are so complex, it would be almost impossible to get it into Drupal core. And same thing with custom modules. So you can make a module that installs config. You have a few options in the configuration folder. You can install, you can override, or you can have it optional where the configuration exists, it just fails. That's good for like adding new configuration, but you can't update existing configuration. So you would need to do update hooks or manual steps after that install process to alter core or other contribs configuration. So introducing Drupal recipes. So a Drupal recipe installs, first thing it does is it installs modules and themes. So you want Claro as your theme, you can install it. You want to use meta tag, you can install it. After that, you can create or update configuration. So once you install metatag, it comes with 5 config files, but you can alter those after you install it. There is an idea in this where you can create content using configuration. So, configuration files are simple YAML files. What's to say you can't say foobar, you have a field name and add this content to your field. But this is just a concept at this time. Doesn't actually exist. And then it applies other recipes. So I can have a recipe that does all this and then applies a second recipe that does all this. What recipes don't do? They don't have their own code. So there isn't the idea that it's a traditional module where you can have PHP functions and libraries and all the things that modules do. They don't make dynamic changes. They don't provide their own upgrade path. So they're ephemeral. Like once we install a recipe, they're gone. So you don't have to maintain it moving forward. But Jim, what if I need to do things before and after or during the recipe installations? Well, you can add another recipe if it's after. There are no hooks to keep it as simple as possible, so you could install modules as you go. So your recipe could require a module that could do things afterwards or in between. And then as this initiative is in its infancy, it's about a year and a half old, as of this time, everything's subject to change. So Drupal core initiatives, for those that don't know, usually are born out of somebody's proof of concept code. So like the project browser, which is a way to find modules and themes inside of Drupal, that was seemingly built in a weekend by somebody. And then it's been reiterated over the last 2 years, to work and get it into core. And what these initiatives do is they work outside of core. So a lot of core moves all the time, and you create patches and merge requests against it. Instead of working in the core issue queue, a lot of these initiatives are working in the contrib space. So I'll share the recipes project is actually a complete fork of Drupal that gets updated when Drupal gets updated. So like that's 10.0, 10.1. So we can reiterate, we can break things, we can do whatever we want inside of this project, and then eventually, once everything's ready, we would have one gigantic merge request or patch that could get it into Drupal core. So same thing with these single directory components that Mike Kerschel's talking about today. That idea was a few months out, and Matteo and his team went in and built a proof of concept that works, and they showed it to the Drupal core committers, and bang, they got it in as an experimental module. So that's how things work, and while it's in that stage, things are iffy, they can break, but it's safe to use because once you install the recipe, again, it's gone. So like you don't have anything that will linger for your clients or anything like that. Okay, so let's take a look at what a recipe is. So it's in a folder. It has a recipe.yaml file. It has a configuration folder where you can load configuration files. So this would be the same as your configuration folder for your site. The only thing, it doesn't need a UUID. UUID makes it unique to your site. In this case, my node type event that would create a content type called event, just needs to have the items that it needs to create that thing. So that was the simplest recipe. Inside the YAML, we'll go down here. So in this recipe.yaml, it has a name and a type. So in this case, it's event, and it's a content type. The recipes would look for another recipe with that name, Event Manager, in the same folder as your existing recipe. So in this case, Event Manager is going to be a user role. It's going to install modules, so it's going to install the date time range module and the node module, if they're not installed. And then we have config actions, which is really the magic that makes recipes work. So in this case, we're going to use the action that allows us to alter configuration. So we're going to go into an existing config, user role event manager, and we're going to grant permissions to edit and delete any event. So up here we have installed the recipe event manager. We've installed these two modules, and then because we installed that recipe, we can alter the configuration here. So this allows us to think of down the road, we have a whole event system where we could have a bunch of different little recipes that are aggregated into one that says, I want a content type, I need this taxonomy, I need these roles and these permissions on those roles, and then a calendar view that would go along with that. So the config actions API. There is a module in Contrib called config actions. This was worked on as part of that still exists for modern Drupal. But the config actions API was committed a few months ago, and that's how we are altering the config. We have an open issue that we want to look at what Drupal core configuration entity methods should be config actions. Right now there's only a handful because as we work through our exercises of what we want recipes to do, we've created those config actions. But there could be more. So this is kind of like a meta issue. It's like a research issue. There's instructions on it on how to go into Drupal core's API documentation and research configuration entity methods to determine what all those are and what could possibly be used by the recipes team. A little bit more technical, where are the config actions? They're kept in Drupal core config action plugin config action. How do you find them? Somebody made a nice Drush PHP eval script that can actually search for them in the code base. And what config actions exist? So the simple config update is the most common used one. So this is kind of like a foo bar, like a action and something to A and B. So in this instance, with this action, you put the config you want to alter, so no .dot settings. We want to do the simple config update, and we want to take from that config, use admin theme, true. So this is how we can alter configuration using a recipe. So you can, in this instance, we're using the admin theme. We are allowing admins only to register, and we are using the Gin admin theme. So, I mean, like, this is something that every site builder does when they start a Drupal site. These kind of simple configurations, like a good recipe that I'm going to share in a little bit, could knock 4 hours out of a Drupal build, just like that. Ensure exists. This is used to conditionally create a config entity. An entity create is a config action that can be used to create a config entity, like ensure exists. Create, these two are not used anywhere yet. They were part of the port of the initial recipes build, but nobody's exactly sure how they would use them yet. So that's one thing that in early initiative phases, some things get built out that people may not need. Under additional entity methods, I showed this one earlier, the grant permissions. With this, we can alter the config, as I showed you before. So there's grant permissions, there's set filter configs, so that targets CK editor filters. And I think that's it for entity methods. And then we have an issue queue, again, to find that. There's this duplicate slide. Okay, to recap, going through the recipes initially, they're applied to Drupal and not installed. They're easy to share. They're a folder, like another module. They don't lock sites in. I should restart my computer more often. They're composable from other recipes, so recipes can call other recipes, and they leave no trace. So there are issues in our queue where people say, like, well, maybe we should track that a recipe's been installed. So that's not, at this point, it's not in the roadmap, but could be in the future down the line. But at this time, they leave no trace. Okay, so I'm going to pop open this excellent blog post by Kevin Quinlan. It's a step-by-step guide to installing the functionality needed for recipes and to get going today. So using the standard composer installed Drupal, you need to require a composer installers extender. So we add a different type. Usually it's already on your project. But basically, we're saying if it's a Drupal recipe, install it in this specific folder. There is a patch needed for recipes. So it's a single patch they apply to Drupal 10 and above. That's there. You start your Drupal install, so we recommend using the minimal profile. So the minimal has very minimal configuration. If you install Drupal with a standard profile, you get things like media and article and page content type and a few taxonomies. So we want to start with like almost as little as we can so we can decide what goes into Drupal. So install Drupal, and then we are going to require his recipe, which Kevin's base recipe was all those things I mentioned earlier. You're going to install an admin theme. You're going to put on caching, config ignore, meta tag, CSP, redirect, and install it. Applying the recipe. So there is a Drupal script now in core. It's kind of Drush-like, where you can use the recipe command. So it's PHP and then core scripts Drupal. Recipe is the command and then where that recipe is. And it goes through and you can see that the recipe was applied, and you can go in and check it out. So here's a little bit of what he's looking at. So in the config, mentioned this earlier, you can import config that exists in your recipe, so you can have a config folder, but you can also install configuration from the modules you're installing. So unlike a normal module install, when you install modules from a recipe, the config isn't imported by default. So in this instance, you want to define the configurations that you want imported. So you can say, I want all of them. So with dblog, image media, media library, put a star there. We're importing all the config from those. But redirect has 2, 3, 4 views that maybe you don't need. So you can specify only the ones you want. So it's down that list. For themes, the gin theme, you can import the blocks that you want. So say you're not using help in this instance. They're not using help, so they're not including the help block that goes there. So that's pretty cool. And then, again, he goes in and alters some of the configuration that was made by those modules he installed and by Drupal Core. There is a effort, or an idea, I would say, to integrate this with Project Browser down the road. So working with Drupal Association, having a new project type on Drupal.org that is a recipe, not a module or a theme, and then Project Browser would be able to help you discover recipes. And then there's a couple adjacent efforts. So while Kevin was working on this, he created a Drush script called Recipe Generator. So he made a project for this on Drupal.org. Boom, there it is, which helps you make a recipe. And there's another effort called Composer Recipe Unpack. So if you're installing all these modules, you're installing these contrib modules, you should have a composer file in your recipe. Well, the Composer Unpack package would actually unpack that from your recipes composer to your main site's composer, which is pretty cool. So then next time you do composer update from your main project, you would update all the stuff that the recipe installed. And buy Kevin's book. It's great. Okay, so close this. Okay. Recipe generator. All right, so you're like, Jim, this sounds great. How do I help out? So there's a Slack channel in the Drupal Slack called Distributions of Recipes. There is a meeting every 2 weeks where there is post issues that need to be done. People can ask questions. It's an asynchronous Slack meeting, so we basically start the meeting, post questions, and then it's open for people to come and check it out later. There is a ping list, so there's this meta issue of meetings, and there's a ping list, so if you're in the Drupal Slack and you want to get pinged when I post the meeting or someone else posts the meeting, you can add your name to this list and you'll get pinged instead of doing @here or @channel like some of your coworkers do and annoy everybody. So that's fun. And there's a ton of documentation, and it's a little all over the place, but there is a strategic initiative page on Drupal.org. So there's a section of all the strategic initiatives. So this is a pretty cool page. If you go over here, you can see all of the large efforts that Drupal has. That wasn't it, but somewhere around there. Basically, just kind of all of the good starting point to get there. Next up is the idea. So in the Drupal, there's a Drupal core ideas issue queue where people just throw ideas out there, and you can see that this was actually started in April of 2022 about how we want to change Drupal core to include recipes. So, a lot of the distribution folks here Open Social, Varbase, Contenta, Thunder, Local Gov, like they had discussions at DrupalCon Prague, and how, identified the problem, came up with the proposed resolution. So once this effort gets merged into core, this issue can be closed. As I mentioned earlier, there is a project page. So this is just like a module, except it is all of Drupal core. Basically, has simple instructions, how to patch Drupal core to get recipes to work, how to apply the recipes, that Drupal PHP script, and then the page is kind of like meaningfully sparse, just so we have all the information elsewhere. There are a lot of technical docs inside the document, so these will probably be moved to Drupal.org once they're solidified, but at this point we're keeping it in the repository on the 1.x branch, so we can alter them as we go, update examples, and give instructions to folks. All right, and then because this is a Drupal core initiative, and because it touches configuration systems in Drupal core, there is also a distributions and recipe tag. So for things that are recipe adjacent, which there's a few different efforts there, there is also this tag that can follow. And the initiative is looking for co-maintainers, additional leads, contributors. It's led by Alex Pott, who I mentioned earlier. He's on sabbatical this summer with his family, so the initiative is slowly progressing. But if anybody's interested in petting cats and contributing to initiatives, there's the roadmap inside of the docs that I explained earlier. And I'm going to talk about what we're trying to do now. So to prove the concept of recipes working completely, we have a few issues in the issue queue. This is actively being worked on. We want to model core's standard install profile as recipes. So if you ever looked at core and then go into the install profiles module, it's basically a module that has configuration. So what we're doing is we're looking at what each one of those configurations do and then making them recipes. So we don't want one big massive recipe like Kevin did. Kevin's is very opinionated, but because it's Drupal core, like I want to be able to install the article content type, but I don't want the tags taxonomy. So how do I do that? I make a recipe for the tags taxonomy. I make a recipe for the article content type, and then I make a recipe that would have the article content type with the tags taxonomy. So we're doing kind of like a stack of all, and then at the end, once all of those recipes are built out, then we could have a standard install profile recipe that would install the whole tree. And in that, I'm making an assumption, but we should be able to also install the minimal, which has a few configurations too. But I would love to install just the media suite and leave a lot of the rest of the standard install profile behind. When I start with minimal, I'm like, where's the media? Yeah, it's my fault. I did that. And then what's even more complicated is Drupal core has an install profile called Umami, which installs a recipe site. Coincidence. This is even more complicated because it includes content. So that's where that idea that we should be able to install content from configuration entities comes from. So This one's more opinionated. It is technically experimental, I think, so we might not have to do that to get it into core. But it would be a good process to move from a site setup kind of idea of recipes to a more of a distribution. So like you can think of OpenY as a big distribution, and OpenY. I assume that the YMCA is going to have standard content that they would want on every site. So that would have it there. The adjacent work I was talking about, Wim Leers gave this excellent presentation in Pittsburgh at DrupalCon last month about configuration validation. So, configuration has really good structure, right? So, you can look at a config and you can see what module provided it and what name it had, or what bundle it is and what instance it is, just by the file name. And while most of the things we're doing, we're exporting config from Drush and importing config, there isn't much validation happening in Drupal. So Wim and a few other people are working on making more validation happen in that config area, which would only lead to more the ability to use configuration for more things. Okay, so that's it. So anybody have any questions?
So you use a recipe, right, to start your site. I guess I got a couple of questions. One, does it have to be on like a brand new Drupal site, or could you have your site running and then see a recipe that you wanted to use and go ahead and import it?
No, so that's the idea, is that we could add a recipe to an existing site.
So like any point in time?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes. I can tell you right now, there is going to be a failure if config exists and is altered. So say I installed the media entity, or I went with the standard profile, I have the image media entity, and I added a caption field to it. So recipes don't know what to do if existing configs have been altered yet. So right now, no, but the plan is that, yes, I want a calendar or I want a blog added to the site, I can do it at any time.
So once you use a recipe, you can kind of like throw it away. It doesn't have to be part of your code base because it's already kind of been imported. Is that the right idea?
Yeah.
Okay. And then is there like an update path for recipes? Like, hey, version 1 of this recipe has like this limited set of functionality, and then maybe a maintainer or somebody improves the functionality. Could you just reapply that recipe?
So it would be reapplying the recipe. It wouldn't be updating config. So that's a way where a distribution maintainer would be able to improve, and the site owner would have the option to reapply the recipe. So, I mean, even if you did, so if you installed the recipe from Composer and using Composer installers said it was a recipe, like you could even update it, but it's not going to apply to your site until you run that recipe script.
Right. Very cool.
Is there any work for like a recipe user interface?
That is on the roadmap for 2027, I think. Yeah, no, I mean, when we go all the way back to the Dries node and we started talking about ambitious site builders again, yeah, a UI for building recipes would be really good. The drush command is a little bit of a helper. There are some tools in the features realm where you export config. So like, if you actually site built out a site and then used features to export the config that you needed and then use the recipe CLI to make a recipe, it's there. But I envision something like Tor UI. I don't know if anybody's ever played with the Tor module. Tor UI, Tor's in core, soon to be kicked out of core, but Tor UI is a module that helps you build tours and then export it to YAML. So like something like that, there are things that do work like that. Web form would be another good
Right.
example where you can use some kind of GUI to export YAML.
Yeah, so I have 120 sites on Acquia Site Factory running off one profile with features. So I know this world very well. I'm very excited for this, and I'm going to volunteer to help in some way. But it's kind of an interesting world because this sort of falls between the profile, which starts you on some things, and the features, which runs the update. But I'll give you that the features is far too complex at this point to keep track of. But it sounds like a lot of the similarities between that model and the recipes model is where this is headed.
Yeah, it's not meant to be a replacement for distributions, but it's meant to be a tool in the toolkit. So there is. There are some things where you're going to need to maintain forever. We know that, but there are some things where, you should be able to just install it and then it's the site owners, right?
Yeah, having the multiple recipes thing is, I think, helpful because right now we just end up with so many features, and then keeping track of those number of features is quite complicated.
Yeah.
So you just said it's not meant to be a replacement for distributions. Can you kind of talk about like once recipes is kind of like fully actualized, like where you might still want to use a distribution versus like a set of recipes?
So I think a distribution would use a set of recipes,
Okay.
but then they're also going to use modules that have update hooks that update things too. So their recipes would, their recipes would have custom modules or would install contrib modules that do the things they need to do to constantly maintain it.
Got it. Okay. I see. So a distribution might have a custom, like a distribution-specific module.
Yeah.
That's where recipes is really just a YAML file that tells Drupal to use something.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
I have a series of small custom modules that are really just paragraph types with default configuration that I pass out to all of our brand new sites, and then I customize from there. I'm very interested in what you're doing. If you haven't already, can you clarify like what are the benefits of doing that via a recipe set of custom modules?
Sure. So you're installing a module that installs paragraphs.
With specific fields and 90% of the way there for just about every kind of site we build.
Sure. So paragraphs, one, you couldn't uninstall that module. If you uninstall that module, you probably couldn't uninstall that module. Without an uninstall hook, you'd still have a paragraph. It's more when you get into one step above that, content types. So if you're installing a paragraph with a module, you have your config in config install in the module.
And optional too, so I don't have to
Yeah.
avoid conflicts.
Yeah, so one benefit I have is I have a media paragraph that I can put a media or a grid on there, but you'd have to duplicate media or create your own media entities to install with that paragraph. With a recipe, you could say, go get me Core's media entities already, if they aren't installed already. But the real benefit is one level up for if you were to have a content type that called those paragraph types. So you can't alter core config from your module, you can only install it. So say you had a content type for page or calendar event or whatever like that, you could actually go in and alter the existing configuration and then make it use your, update the field to reference the paragraphs. Yeah. But yeah, same thing. I have a module called Bootstrap Paragraphs that installs paragraphs, and it works well.
So they work together via, it's just another tool, I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's not a replacement for a custom module that
Yeah,
creates
yeah.
initial configuration. It's just,
Yeah, but the process is similar. So you went through, you site built a bunch of paragraphs at one point and
Yeah.
built templates and CSS and JavaScript that you
yeah, I've
needed.
got a starter site that I get basic config out of, and it also holds our base starter theme.
Yeah,
And
so
stitch it all together.
yeah, so in this instance, you know, instead of creating that module, you would create a recipe that would have the config in there. Very similar process, but using a recipe, you could also install the theme and set the theme to who can see the theme. Yeah. Who can see the admin theme? Who can see the front end theme?
Right.
Those are permissions that need to be set. We can't do that right now from a module.
Right.
So it's the next step of just having a module that installs config. You know, I have a module called SEO Starter. I went through Ben Finkley's Drupal 8 SEO book, and I did the same thing. I built out a site using it. I exported that config, and that module requires X amount of modules, but I can't ever uninstall any modules because the starter module I used requires those modules. So if somebody didn't want to use the coffee module or meta tag or something like that, they want to use another solution, they couldn't ever uninstall meta tag because my module requires it. Whereas a recipe, because it's more ephemeral, I gave that to you, I gave you that meta tag configuration, but if you don't want to use meta tag, you can uninstall the module because it's yours.
Exactly. We all maintain the Utopia distribution, and we're able with config actions and everything, able to do everything recipes does with contrib modules, but it's a lot more work to maintain than if everyone were using the same system. So once this becomes more mainstream, then you can use a core recipe as a dependent on yours, or I can use your recipe in mine. And right now, the goal with Utopia is that we start doing that with a bunch of feature modules, but everyone else isn't doing it, and so there's very little configuration sharing that way. And we're like, we want to be able to switch from core contact module to using web form. That would uninstall this feature, which would uninstall that feature, and it's just, and so trying to break out of that in the current approach is super hard.
Yeah.
My question, will recipes replace installation profiles?
I hope so.
Yes.
Yeah. So
That's where I start with installation.
yeah. That is the initial goal because install profiles are in core. There are no distributions in core, right? So installed profiles is what recipes would replace eventually. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah.